We tend to price Bitcoin in US dollars and think about the success of adoption in terms of how it's going in the West. The largest country in the world has a long and complicated relationship with Bitcoin. China has banned Bitcoin many times over the last decade, and our guest today has written a book called Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? Roger Huang has been writing about Bitcoin since 2014 and is joining us today for an insightful conversation about the state of Bitcoin in China. I'm Scott Dietels. I'm the CEO and founder of Block Rewards. Part of our mission in bringing Bitcoin to the workplace is helping people understand how it will help them. So if you're interested to learn something about how Bitcoin is viewed and being used in China, stick around. This one is a very interesting dive into Bitcoin across the other side of the Pacific. All right, welcome to another episode of the Block Reward podcast. We are joined this week by our guest, Roger Huang. Roger, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Special topic from this week for me. We're talking about Bitcoin in China, which is a subject of a recently published book of yours, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? So this is a huge subject, which I have been really excited about and interested in for a long time. When I saw you publish your book, I bought it right away. So yeah, I want to thank you about it for writing such a detailed work. And I thought maybe as a point of interest, my background is history. I think every culture has their own unique relationship with Bitcoin that relates intimately to how their culture understands money. And China, obviously, one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history, and one that is sort of the origin point of paper money. Maybe you could just start with a little bit of a talk, or a little bit of your thoughts around China's history of monetary evolution.
Yeah, one of the things that surprises people all the time is when they open the book, they're like, "Oh, this starts in the 1980s in China," as opposed to the 2000s or when Bitcoin started. And the reason why I really chose to focus on that is, like, to what you mentioned, Scott. I think every civilization has its own relationship with paper money. China has like a really specific relationship with money, being the first, you could say, like nation state like entity to adopt paper money, and the first to suffer its consequences. I think this has given a very unique view into Chinese policy even today. For example, the People's Bank of China is very, very focused on protecting the value of the yuan. I mean, they semi-peg it to the USD, but the whole idea is like they don't want to be too accommodating because China has been through so many bouts of inflation in the past. And that inflation has led to like many disastrous cycles, of which I think in the West, for example, the United States has not necessarily been through something like that yet. So one example of that is, Scott, as you appreciate Chinese history, the Yuan dynasty, which once, spanned almost all of Asia and essentially like some parts into Europe as well, fell because of debasement of the paper money. They were just printing the paper money too much, and the Ming dynasty was able to take over. It even was a large part of how the communists took over from the nationalists. So people talk a lot about Weimar Germany as kind of this example of, we have this dramatic political transition after economic ruin and debasement of money. But China has an equally as dramatic, people, and if you look it up online, you'll see in Shanghai, people were also carting around barrels of paper money. And Mao Zedong has always said that, inflation was one of the reasons why he won. And so the Chinese Communist Party has been actually very sensitive to inflation. And Mao's solution to that was to, being a more of a, you could say, tyrant and bloodthirsty tyrant at that, was to implement government force and to make quotas. So government control. So there was no inflation in China during Mao because the government literally dictated what prices would be. But later on, the party did inherit, although the party turned away from many of Mao's policies, the party did inherit this particular grasp of Chinese history and economics. And so inflation has always been really important. The People's Bank of China has always accorded a high priority, to fighting too much of an accommodative monetary policy. One of the funny things I see is the People's Bank of China is always constantly telling people in its pronouncements that, like, look at the West. The West has been like so accommodative. The ECB has like negative interest rates, but we have actually maintained a firm money supply relative to everything. So that's just one element that comes out of that. So that affects the state, but we want to talk about the people. And that's also one thing that's probably a constant theme that comes up in these interviews. You know, the Chinese people are not the Chinese party state. I consider myself like a Huaqiao, which is kind of a Chinese diaspora member that's gone back and forth. I was born in China. I grew up there for a bit, and then moved out. My family still goes back and forth between China and Canada. But, you know, Chinese people have a really different, especially the diaspora as well, or at least the diaspora more publicly able to vent about this, has so many different views, right? And that can be different from the party state in many ways. Bitcoin is actually one of these really interesting points because a lot of people will still buy Bitcoin even though, you know, the government forbids it in many different ways, right? But the Chinese people also have a really specific relationship with inflation and savings. I think one thing that pops up in a macro perspective is that China's savings rate is traditionally very high. People are banked. This shows up in different ways in the Chinese economy. For example, their M2 money supply, China's M2, which is a measure of kind of banked money over GDP, is the highest in the world, China and Hong Kong. And part of the function of that is that there's such a high savings rate. I think based off of my personal experience, and I mean, obviously different people have different perspectives on this, but one reason why I think this is the case and something like Bitcoin can be really appealing to a lot of people is two reasons. One is that culturally speaking, Chinese people are more on the saving curve. This is because, and I believe, like, when you look at China's recent history, there's been a lot of calamity. There was a cultural revolution. There was the world's largest man-made famine, which was the Great Chinese Famine between 1959 and 1962. And this has incentivized a generation of people who don't necessarily think things are certain. I mean, that has faded a little bit, but certainly I think that's one factor. And the second is that, which we can get into more, China has capital controls. And so for the longest time, recently it's loosened them up a little bit. Like, for example, you can, in Beijing and Shanghai, if you're a foreigner, you can take more money out, but there is a $50,000 USD a person a year limit on the people who can, on the funds that you can transact in and out of the system. And so this leads to kind of this wall garden where you can, a lot of Chinese people have made a lot of money, but that money has to stay within Chinese borders. That is one thing that Bitcoin has intersected with as well. And I'm happy to talk about that. But yeah, I think that's been a long dialogue on history. So Scott, happy to have you step in, or if you have any other questions.
Yeah, you know, and one of the fascinating aspects of Chinese culture, I think, is as being this sort of really ancient continuous civilization, is the memory of these even distant events. It's the same culture. Whereas, you know, North American, Western, we're talking about, you know, nation states that are really babies, hundreds of years old compared to thousands. And so, you know, the United States, as an example, isn't old enough to have experienced these multiple rises and falls that are very much in the memory of the history. These sites, these cities are preserved and they exist today, and people still live there. And it is a fascinating and very unique part about China that has always interested me. And you mentioned about the book starting in the 80s. Which I also learned something. So as the Communist Party was transitioning, entering a period of transition after Mao passed in the late 70s, there was a division of opinions around how to move forward economically. And one thing I didn't really realize was how intertwined with inflation and economic decisions the Tiananmen Square protests were.
No, I think that most people don't realize that time period in the 1980s was just so particular. And it shaped the policy of China for a very long time, actually, until you could say to the present. Because that whole debate, you know, price reform, because the big thing in the 80s the Chinese Party state was trying to do is, okay, we came out of Mao, and it was kind of like a shock therapy of sorts. The whole idea was like, how do you start liberalizing the economy? And so one of the first things that happened, I think one of the things correlated with Chinese economic growth was like, we're going to allow for private enterprise. So under Mao, you could not actually start a company with more than 5 employees. That was one of the first things, the reformers tried to get rid of. And when I say the reformers, I mean, I cite them in my book. It's Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang. Hu Yaobang was the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and then Zhao Ziyang, who was the premier, which is kind of the economic role. But Deng Xiaoping was kind of the paramount leader at the time. So really short, because, people might not have context on this. Mao died. Before Mao died, he tried to set the Cultural Revolution or determine who his heirs would be. Actually, the people who succeeded him were the people who tried to kill, which was Deng Xiaoping. Part of the reason why he tried to imprison or repress Deng Xiaoping was because he considered Deng Xiaoping to be a capitalist rotor, which was kind of like the biggest sin you could commit in Mao's China at the time. And that was because Deng had these ideas of, well, why don't we... It doesn't seem to be working. Like, the Chinese economy is in shambles. People are very poor. People are starving. How do we, create economic growth? And then, so Deng Xiaoping was actually able to advance those reforms because he actually won out in power. And so there were some progressive reformers with them at the same time. But one of the things they tried to do in that time period was to liberalize price reform, meaning like let the market set prices instead of the government. So this is something that Chinese people were not used to at the time, right? And immediately during the 80s, the consequence of that was inflation. I mean, there was at one point, I think right before Tiananmen Square, about 18.5% annualized inflation. So that was, the student protesters Tiananmen Square, tons of different reasons. I don't want to say that inflation was the only one or, even like the main one, but you have to remember the context of that time. And people were starting to see some of the benefits. They were like, oh, there's Coca-Cola on the shelves, but it's costing me like 18% or 20% more every year. And that's just not something I'm used to, because I'm used to a system where the price stays the same throughout like a whole generation, right? So that was definitely destabilizing. And because of the inflation, actually, the reformist faction of China, which wanted to do both economic reforms and political reforms, ended up losing out because they had to resign because there were different student protests. And so the current power generation in China, Xi Jinping's father, for example, is part of this thing called the Eight Elders, conservative faction. They kind of maintain their power because they won out. Deng Xiaoping decided to side with them because he was so concerned about the student protesters at Tiananmen Square. He thought it was another cultural revolution. So the way China is shaped today, and a lot of the PBOC officials and everyone who like has economic power as well as political power, they kind of shaped their views during that time period. And I think the view that came out of it was like, oh, we can have markets, we can have liberalization, but the party has to maintain firm control. And so, you see that now. I mean, in just the way the political structure of China is and how China interacts with Bitcoin. Frankly, like China was one of the first countries to ban Bitcoin. And part of the reason why is because of this background. They're just so aware of like the importance of state control in their model.
Yeah, I think it would be impossible to properly talk about the subject of Bitcoin in China without a little bit of the context of, all of these subjects. And so what emerged out of that is kind of this middle road policy where it's, we'll call it authoritarian-ish government policies and free market economics, which on its own has been a very unique experiment, with some aspects of it being like massively successful and something that couldn't really be applied everywhere. Probably like all of this relates back to all of the things that happened prior to these events. So we move forward to early Bitcoin days, and a lot of early Bitcoin actually did happen in China, right? Early miner technology, a lot of the hash rate was in China for a long time, and as you mentioned, there's been multiple bans. Maybe let's just shift forward and talk a little bit about the early days of Bitcoin in China.
Yeah, I mean, so all the stuff that we talked about, this unique attraction, which still exists among Chinese people to Bitcoin, right? Some of the OGs, they're like, oh, this is stateless money. I've been waiting for this for my whole life, right? Because I also do think Chinese people are just so aware too of like state repression. Because if you live online anywhere in China, right? There is always that element of like some amount of censorship, some amount of repression, and some amount of different things. And so you had these people running internet cafes that decided like, hey, like, let me go and mine Bitcoin instead, right? Like I have all these GPUs. You had people who were like, China is the hardware manufacturing. It was also like a very unique moment. Like Bitcoin emerged at a geopolitical moment where all the hardware manufacturing in the world really shifted to Asia, right? We're talking about like, hard drives, talking about like integrated circuits, like ASICs. We're talking about like all kinds of different things like that. And early on in China, I think one of the things that was kind of an advantage is you don't really need like the most advanced chips at the beginning to mine Bitcoin, because when that shift came from GPU mining to ASIC mining, and just the short summary of that is that like you used to be able to mine Bitcoin on your own computer with graphics processing units, but then you had to create custom chips that were able to mine, or more precisely do like the hashing required to get to the nonce, the reward that you need in order to find a block, right? Which is how Bitcoin mining works. The whole thing about that is you have these Chinese companies that are like, this fit perfectly into the Chinese model of like just like being able to churn out like hardware. If y'all have ever been to Shenzhen, like there's a huge movement of just like smart hardware apps, a lot of like smart hardware startups. I had a friend who created like smart motorcycle helmets. They would do all their prototyping in Shenzhen because, all the manufacturing was there. Everything was there. All the electronics were there. So you just have this like quick experimental backboard, and the loop is so small because you can go like, hey, I need these specs. I need this part. I need that part. And that would all happen really quickly. And so in China, first you saw the emergence of kind of like the ASICs, right? And what that allowed is the beginning of mining pools. And then what that allowed was some of the early exchanges to then mature, because you got the whole services ecosystem. Because what happened was you got the miners manufactured by Chinese companies, and they still are mainly to this day. An active thing I'm trying to research is just like getting someone from Bitmain to talk to me. It's like much more difficult than you might think, by the way. But, a lot of these devices are still manufactured by Chinese-based companies, or previously Chinese-based companies. And then, okay, well, you're mining all this Bitcoin. So then you have this idea of like mining pools in order to standardize the variance. But then you have all this Bitcoin in China, right? Or essentially controlled by either Chinese nationals or Chinese associated companies. That's like what you do with them. So that's where the exchanges kind of come in, right? And so, for example, like, a lot of the offerings that exchanges offered at the time were relayed around the miners, but also relayed around domestic demand for Bitcoin. So BTCC, I interviewed the founder for the book, Bobby Lee, and he talked a lot about kind of like how the original Chinese Bitcoin scene came up, right? Like having poker with CZ, and like he just like had a miner himself and was just like kind of mining it, made some bets about the 49ers and all this other stuff. So lots of flavor from that, from the OGs. And one of the things though was that they couldn't buy Bitcoin from Mt. Gox because Mt. Gox wouldn't accept yuan deposits. And so they had to kind of create their own exchanges ecosystem. So when you see BTCC, that was kind of like the first one. And then there's like stuff like Huobi and like OKX. And then Binance, I guess, is one that people remember as well. But people also forget that FTX also had its roots kind of in the Hong Kong trading desks as well, which are like secondary derivatives of this trade between like, oh, well, you have all this Bitcoin being mined in China. And there are people who are running these businesses, and some of them are trying to get out of Bitcoin. But then there's also, domestic demand in China for renminbi to Bitcoin deposits, right? And so that's kind of how you had that whole matured ecosystem. So I really do think, and I make the argument in the book, that like in China, that's where Bitcoin went from more of a hobbyist project to that matured ecosystem. So all the firmaments of what we see now, the miners, the exchanges, everything that helped get the first, I would say, billion users onto Bitcoin, like that really grew out of China, I think.
And it is such a fascinating intersection of all these different So you have a firmer government control ecosystem managing a deregulating economy with a history of inflations and debasement throughout. And in the middle sits this technology that is undilutable money. And it's sort of like, of these two worlds wrestling perfectly in the middle. And so I've always wondered how that's playing out. And I think one of the greatest fallacies of Western propaganda is the idea that we are so free and they're so oppressed. And when the reality is a lot more gray, right? Like we're oppressed, or our freedoms are managed differently here, but people in China experience a lot of freedom. There are just other things that aren't as free. Yeah. So I think that's one of the greatest probably misconceptions outsiders who've never been to China really don't understand, what things are like on the ground there. There have been a number of Bitcoin bans issued in China with varying degrees of failure. Is it 7? Is that?
Yeah, there's been a bunch. I mean, I have to like remember back to exactly how I categorized it, but like in the book, there's like I think 6 or 7. But yeah, there's been quite a few. But before I talk about that, like I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what you just said, because I think it's kind of interesting as well. Something for context for the audience is one of the things that I talk about, and it comes up a lot because policy people ask me about the digital yuan, or they ask me about like Chinese policy, and they're like, there's always a sense like, oh, it can't happen to us because the West has this or this freedom or that freedom or different things like that. And I will say in China, it's like you mentioned, the freedoms are managed slightly differently. I will say their security state, I think, sometimes tends towards the extreme or paranoid about smaller instances of things. So, for example, people tweeting to like very few followers and things like that. I've definitely seen people being arrested for that. We were going to talk about this soon, but like people are arrested for trading like virtual currencies in of itself. So there definitely is law enforcement and criminal penalties for things that we in the West, I guess, or people in the West would see as not necessarily deserving that level of scrutiny or punishment. But on the other hand, I do think that people aren't, I think people think of China as so dystopian that it actually clouds your judgment on like what the implications less can be drawn for the West. And I do talk about this a lot because, for example, in the West, you have like a surveillance state as well, just in other words. And you can't really just parse over this excuse of like, oh, Chinese, and Chinese people also find different ways to like escape and evade all this stuff. And they can talk about different topics. It's not like, it's not like this like instant robot ban or something. It's like, hey, you said like forbidden words, so you're instantly banned from the internet. It's not really, it doesn't really quite work that way.
And I think, and I don't mean to interrupt, but like, I think it's very true to say the average Westerner has no concept of exactly how surveilled we are. There may not be the same level of enforcement, but certainly there's a lot more information gathering going on than people might want to believe.
Yeah, I mean, I have my own. I can go to this whole other thread. I mean, I think the Chinese party state has a lot of information about different people, but in the West, it's actually baked into the system. Like the United States has information about everyone's banking correspondent records or Visa cards or things like that. I was just talking with a friend about this. It's crazy. Apparently, the FSB travels under their own credit cards in some instances. And so like, the American government's able to trace assumably the American government, don't know that we know exactly who is, but most likely the American government or American banking system is able to provide information on this like right away. Like the combination of the Bank Secrecy Act and PRISM pretty much means that like the American control of the internet rails, as well as like the US correspondent banking system and most transfers, means that like the Americans know pretty much everything. Well, not every, I should be more careful. Not like everything, but they know a lot about you. And it's like in the like rails themselves, if that makes sense. Like in China, there's this whole thing where like they go and they like hack into different systems and they have APTs and they'll get people's social security numbers. But in the West, it's actually part of the system. You almost like don't question it. You're like, of course banks do KYC AML. But like, in the 80s, this was like a live debate. Like some banks refused to do it because they thought it was unconstitutional. But now we live in this world where it's like accepted as just part of the thing. And so that is one thing I bump into, because people are always like, oh, well, this all stuff happens to China and it's very dystopian. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not that far from happening to you as well. And it has happened. Up in Canada, we had the Emergency Act invocation. In the United States, I think as Canadians, we're in this unique position of like, our rights don't matter at all to the American surveillance state. So essentially, like, all of our communications and all of our financial transactions, I assume, are tracked. So anyways, that's a little bit of a sidebar on that, but that is a thought I often have when I talk about these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So to come back to banning Bitcoin in China, because I think it's a point of interest for Westerners, and it's something that gets thrown around in the Western media very loosely. Oh, China's banned Bitcoin. Maybe just, let's talk a little bit about what you've understood about how successful or unsuccessful various ban attempts of Bitcoin in China have been.
Yeah, we could start with like the biggest one. I think 2021, that was like the really big one. And that was when the Chinese kind of like the State Council, which is the governing administration of kind of like, they're not elected entities, but like roughly the equivalent of a parliament, I guess, in Canada, or you can think of Congress in the States, or specifically the executive agencies in the States. Liu He, who was vice premier at the time and is Xi Jinping's one of his closest economic advisors, basically said like Bitcoin mining is harmful to the whole of Chinese society. So we cannot allow this to proceed anymore. So previously, before, the provinces allowed a lot of Bitcoin businesses and a lot of Bitcoin mining. And I think the mining ban and that time frame is also when you started getting criminal law enforcement. This is the first time China really involved the Supreme People's Procuratorate, which is kind of like the equivalent of like the FBI, I guess you could say, as well as the Supreme People's Courts. So these bans were really meant to, at the beginning, China tried a variant of like different things. They tried like different things that they thought were going to slow down Bitcoin, right? But it didn't work because Bitcoin was always designed to be resistant to those kind of bans. So the first thing they tried was like, Chinese banks should not deal in Bitcoin. That's not even regulated like in the West per se, but like banks still refuse to deal with Bitcoin anyways, or most of them do. So the whole thing about Bitcoin though is like it's designed to be resilient to that, right? It is be your own bank. So that didn't really matter. The Chinese Party state has also tried banning people because they have the Cyberspace Administration, and they do ban people if you get big enough for certain things, right? So that is one thing they do. They tried cutting it off that way, right? Like that's also another way. And then another way is also to put like the Great Firewall on some sites that you don't want visited, right? So for example, foreign exchanges or coin market cap or things like that, right? So all these things have been not successful in the sense of they definitely didn't affect Bitcoin globally. I think they were really a play out of like Bitcoin as being resistant due to geographic arbitrage, right? I think it's also very difficult to ban Chinese people from understanding and learning about Bitcoin, which there's still like a ton of resources out there, including on GitHub and other places, right? I also think, and then once you have the knowledge, like how do you know how to run your own full node? How do you know what like self-custody is? How do you know how to manage like private keys? That's like very hard to prevent people from doing that, especially people who have access to VPNs for other functions or who, travel abroad and come back or things like that, right? Like, so like as a ban, I don't quite think the Chinese Party state was trying to do this, but if their idea was like, hey, like there's a lot of in China and there's a lot of activity in China and we're going to try to like disrupt Bitcoin, that certainly didn't really work. Bitcoin recovered, the hash rate decreased during like a few weeks, but basically recovered. And now it's like double where it was during the ban, right? It might be slightly less now because like I don't really actually know the current state of given what's going on with like the network and everything, but approximately about double from where it was before. So the bans didn't work in that sense. They have worked a little bit in the sense of like, now when I do talk with Chinese no coiners, like they do think Bitcoin is kind of shadowy. And so, for example, I've talked to like off the record, like a couple of groups, and by off the record, I mean like, cause I'm normally a writer and I normally write about these things and I don't necessarily publish them, but fine spreading it. But, I've talked to groups in Hong Kong, I've talked to other groups, and there seems to be like a little bit of reluctance to embrace Bitcoin. And I think part of that is like, because the Chinese Party State has been so strong against it, people do kind of, even people who like the average person in China, even if they have different opinions about the Chinese Party State, like in general, if the Chinese Party State says like blockchain good, AI good, which is what they've been doing, entrepreneurs and businesses will flock in that direction. And if you're investing, it'll be in the back of your head. It won't like stop you. But I have noticed that like some Chinese no coiners are like a little bit more reluctant, I think, to embrace Bitcoin. I do think they haven't been successful at like destroying the demand for Bitcoin. Because I do think part of the reason why they did the bans was because they were trying to create the digital yuan and position that as an unassailable alternative to Bitcoin. They started researching that in 2014 and accelerated that with the rise of Libra. But then also Bitcoin has been, if you read People's Bank of China, it's always been in the target sites of the central bank, right? So I think this combination of bans and like trying to get people on digital yuan hasn't really worked. The digital yuan is about 0.16% of, the Chinese monetary supply as we speak. I do think that a lot of people in China are discouraged from using Bitcoin as money and not as store of value. This comes up every once in a while because definitely Chinese like medium of exchange uses of Bitcoin are like really hard to nail. But one thing that's kind of interesting about that is like I've written about like people in mainland China. Some of them go abroad, but most of them probably are still in mainland China. They do have Nostra accounts. So it's not like a huge amount of people, but there are some. And you can see like that could be one way. But there's definitely not like merchants officially accepting Lightning Network and things like that. But Bitcoin as property is protected by the Chinese courts. So if you can think of all the, and who knows, any of the OGs, all the miners, all the people who were mining before, I talked with a few people and like a lot of people have speculated, like there's a lot of the trading desks, for example, Genesis in Hong Kong, they ended up trading out all their Bitcoin for like Solana. It's like very, 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 very Web3 anyways. So maybe that also happened to a lot of people, but there still probably is Bitcoin around. So I don't think Bitcoin's banned. So certainly China didn't succeed at destroying Bitcoin. I don't know if that was the original goal, but they certainly didn't succeed at doing that. They might have succeeded at making it seem more shadowing in the margins and slowing the rate of transactions within China and within the broader world. They probably have not succeeded in terms of destroying demand for Bitcoin. Because now you see, for example, the Chinese economy is not doing that hot. And whether it's Bitcoin or other assets, people are looking to invest outside of China. So that's definitely not something that they solved through state repression.
Yeah, there's a few interesting threads there. It makes me think about one, challenges happening domestically with China's residential real estate market, and also the notion that gold in Chinese culture, has an important place as a store of value asset. And so I can imagine that Bitcoin as property is something that would make a lot of sense culturally.
Yeah. Well, the gold point is really important. I mean, so first, in terms of the Chinese residential real estate, just so your listeners know the situation in general, like China is going through essentially close to deflation. There might be a little bit of more inflation. The way they measure is like a little bit inconsistent at some points, but in general, it seems like China is more deflationary than inflationary right now. There are the massive problem that Chinese people have. And this is why I think, by the way, there's like this huge, I didn't write about it as much in the book because I'm not personally as interested in that, but there's a huge L2 community. I talk with a lot of them all the time, just even informally, right? There's a huge L2, there's a huge like kind of like ordinals, like that kind of stuff around China and Taiwan and Hong Kong, definitely Hong Kong. By the way, so like a huge kind of like community around there. When they had Bitcoin Asia, for example, like they had the largest ordinals comp there, a couple of different things. Really random story. I mean, Will, I don't know if you had it on the pod, but when someone offered him, this is one of my favorite stories about how I did research for the book. Like a bunch of people like reached out to him because he was asking for funding. And then people were like, here's like this Nostra token. And then Will being Will was like, this is a shitcoin. This is like an affinity scam. This is terrible. I'm going to chart all the way for it to go to zero, right? And he was just posting live. But if you look at the comments, all the comments are like these people writing in Mandarin, being like, you're like the worst human being on earth. And like, you can see the rally points. It was funny is like, you can see like the accounts on X that, you know, people kind of like are like, like there's these like leaders that are rallying all the retail investors to like go attack Will. And so you can kind of trace like who owns Telegram groups, like who owns different things. But the reality is like that a lot of that is like retail investors. We have this term, I mean, I guess like 韭菜, which means chives. People get offended if you call them that in China. I called my dad that once. He was like kind of offended. But it's kind of like those people who are looking for return. And that's what you're kind of seeing right now in China, because there is like no return on assets. Like there is not really a way to, so people are piling into like government bonds. So the PBOC had to intervene. And there's residential real estate problems. There's actually this really interesting Nostra post that someone posted where they were like, Shenzhen housing, if you denominate it in gold, has been down something like 30%. And so then now also to talk about your gold point. Yeah, China has historically had a really is like nuanced, but also important relationship with gold. Gold has been kind of a currency of sorts in China historically. I think India also shares this. There's like this like very, yeah. And if you've ever been to Hong Kong, you all will know those are like the best gold markets potentially in the world, like physically. I used to get so much jewelry from there. That's the story for another time. But like they have very developed gold markets over there. And one of the things where China kind of interplays in the global economy is if you look at the BRICS economies, they buy gold, like their central banks will buy gold. Like China's central bank bought a ton of gold in the run-up to what's happening now, for example. They won't do that with Bitcoin, right? If anything, they'll do the opposite. So this is where you see like the government's stance on gold. But also, you know, the Chinese People's Association of Gold, there's been these gold ETFs that have kind of like spawned in Chinese domestic equities markets, and they had to be suspended because the trading was too hot, like the volume of demand was too hot. So I do think that saying Bitcoin is digital gold might resonate slightly more with some different audiences there. Gold definitely is a really like treasured store of value. I do also think that the government stance on gold versus Bitcoin actually is impactful enough to like shake out the differences between right now, for example, Bitcoin versus gold prices trending right now in the short term, which I don't usually really care about, but just to put like an interesting kind of example to it, I think gold has been accelerated a lot because of central bank buying of gold. Because they, you know, for example, China now is trying to think about, well, we have all these foreign reserves and intergovernmental debt of the United States. The exact contents of like China's forex, like foreign reserves, is a state secret. We don't know, but we do know they've been downshifting treasuries. You know, we know Japan and the United States are now larger holders of treasuries, for example. And so it's like, where does all that money go though? Both from like the government stance, but also like the Chinese people who are restrained from investing in many different options. So some of that's ending up in Tether, some of that's ending up in Bitcoin. In Hong Kong, there's still like these, not only are there the ETFs, I don't think the ETFs have been that successful, but we can talk about that. But there are OTC desks where people are trading cash for Bitcoin or back and forth. And, you know, I heard reports that people are coming in line and people are just showing up with like tons and tons of Tether, right? And then getting Hong Kong dollars or getting Bitcoin. And the question is like, well, where are they getting the Tether from? Because that's illegal to actually buy Tether in China, for example. But, you know, there's people who do that. There's people who buy on exchanges. So they just put like a foreign address instead of a Chinese address, and the exchanges look the other way. I mean, that all happens, right? So I think the Chinese people and the Chinese government's mentality about Bitcoin, both will still matter to like the price level.
I think you know, there's some interesting points you made about capital controls earlier, and you know, like in some ways, all local government are mechanisms to prevent capital from leaving a political border. Well, this is especially true in China, where they have taken extra steps to prevent money from leaving, and these are things that, you know, partly explain anomalous residential real estate prices in parts of Canada. Yeah. So is this idea of using Bitcoin to get money outside of mainland China, is this an idea that's kind of understood or viewed as a use case?
I think it's a use case, but I also think that is another underrated thing about global macroeconomics that people don't talk about a lot, is just that China's capital controls have like created really interesting effects in the world economy. For example, a Chinese demand for luxury goods. And part of that is because of capital controls. For example, you're allowed to leave with more money than the limits if you're a tourist. So you can say like, I need more spending money in different countries if I'm a tourist. And so that actually distorts luxury markets throughout the world. That also distorts real estate. You know, in Canada, since we're talking about Canada, there have been banks that have been called out because they have essentially facilitated, whether it's like fake mortgages or, you know, like they basically have Canadian banks. This has actually been a sore point of contention between China and Canada, that effectively offer to facilitate the transfer of like large amounts of funds from China to Canada. And, you know, the mechanisms, I'm not going to go too, because it's not necessarily something I've researched or studied in depth, but you can very easily understand that like Canadian banks that are willing to play ball, right? They can accept like Chinese money that's in China as collateral or things like that, right? Or they can do what's called smurfing. So in smurfing, it's basically you have like hundreds of different, this is actually the most common way to evade Chinese capital controls, is it's a very like, it's a very funny thought. It's like, well, it's 50,000 a person a year, but I know a lot of people. So like, you know, I get my family, I get my employees, I get everybody to kind of spend money. So Bitcoin, when it comes to that, I'm not going to say it doesn't play a role. I do think, like to your point, Scott, one of the really interesting things about Bitcoin is that it allows people to transmit money through borders effortlessly in a way that they can't really do with like cash. So I can hold like a hardware wallet, or I can hold my keys that might contain like millions of dollars of value. I can pass through airports like this, right? Good luck trying that with cash. You just wouldn't be able to. I mean, cash in of itself, like kind of the trade-off of cash is like, okay, we allow it to be this anonymous bearer asset, but it's like to your point, like very difficult to leave cash with it outside of borders. Like if you go to any other country, they're going to check if you have more than like $10,000 of cash. They're going to like physically seize it. They're going to like impose customs duties on it. They're going to do all this kind of stuff. You can't do that with Bitcoin. Now, there've been some studies, and I kind of cited the specifics in the book, but people have looked at people who bought Bitcoin with yuan and then sold it at a loss in other currencies as a proxy for that. I think that netted out to like, maybe there was like $5 billion USD worth of volume or something like that. So again, this is something that Bitcoin does play a role in. But I do think that like compared to all the other different things that we're talking about, it's a smaller portion. That said, a lot of the like, you know, it happens. There's like high net worth individuals. There's a couple of ones that I kind of cited in the book that went to like overseas and they bought Bitcoin and then they came back, right? That's like effectively impossible for the Chinese government to really trace. Though one thing I will say as well, just to end this off, is the Chinese government does work with, they've cited it in some of their arrest reports. They do work with some of the exchanges and OTC desks to get information from them. So if it's a China-based exchange, historically, all of them have left China because of the bans. I mean, one part of the bans we didn't talk about as much is exchanges are banned as well. So in theory, you can't trade yuan for Bitcoin. So if you look up Bitcoin yuan trading pairs, they don't exist. All the trade on exchanges for Bitcoin that come from Chinese people are likely done through Tether. And some exchanges no longer serve to Chinese IP addresses. They certainly will not serve you if you put a Chinese address as your address. But most people get away around that by just putting a foreign address or a Hong Kong address or something like that. The exchanges have kind of also been banned, but the Chinese authorities do still work with some of those exchanges and OTC desks to get information. And so there probably is some amount of like people leaving the country in Bitcoin, but that some amount can be traced if they're using like, you know, exchange or OTC desks that were more China based. in the past, or have been. And we know this activity is happening because some of the stories are nuts. I mean, like for example, the United Kingdom holds 61,500 Bitcoin, but people forget that's actually from Chinese nationals. It was like Chinese nationals who, were defrauded, let's say, in an investment fraud. And then the person who perpetuated it actually like converted it all into Bitcoin. And then they gave it to this person called Jian Wen. She just like left in the airport with like 61,500 Bitcoin, right? And then just landed in the UK. So we know this stuff happens. I'm giving you an example where we know this happens because it was like clearly tied to like a criminal case and like all this other stuff. And it was seized by the government. So also, buyer beware kind of thing on that. But we know this kind of activity happens where people are transacting, getting money out of China with Bitcoin. I just don't think it's like the largest cause. But, that could be like a whole show of itself. Like China's capital controls have just shaped the global macroeconomy in ways that like I think people seldom comprehend.
Maybe as a final thought, one thing I'd like to ask you about is, if you've spent time in China, you'll understand China has this rich history of being one of the most important world powers, and throughout these cycles of sort of rising and falling, and it's been ascended again as it relates back to the start of the story in the 80s around a division of opinions around what was the best way for China to move forward. And I feel that, something that is also very palpable is this notion that Chinese people are working collectively to try their best to move the country forward. And so as we approach a bigger crossroads in the future, digital yuan, Bitcoin, changing global macro, what do you think will be the future of Bitcoin in China, let's say in the later part of the decade, maybe the 2030s?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, a little bit like reading tea leaves. But so I spent a lot of time in China, and I would say that my exposure to China is mostly through 80s generation people. So my family and people like that who go back and forth between China and the West. So that's my main exposure to, most of China. They do work with the younger generation, and in the interactions I've had with them and through kind of like listening in on the conversations that the people I know are having or that I've had, are much more nationalistic, are much more prideful of China's place. They grew up in a China that was in a much different position than the China before. And they're very cognizant of that. I've heard statements like, they treat us with more respect now because our passport is worth more, and, with this nationalism, I think there's this interesting curve where you also have a lot of youth unemployment and there's some resentment there. There is resentment that people who have not necessarily been quote unquote as loyal to the country because they went abroad. A lot of the like 80s generation, 90s generation Chinese people, and some of them who have come back to China, they went abroad to get education and they went abroad to get their work experience because there just wasn't anything in China. But now that China's like kind of growing and booming and things like that, some of those people are now back and they're in more senior roles because in China, there's actually like a prioritization of people with foreign work experience. The younger generation, I think, resents that. The younger generation is also very, very nationalistic. And the younger generation is also very tech savvy. And so they're used to using all kinds of digital tools. A lot of them will be used to having a VPN. A lot of them will be used to using like all kinds of different apps, right? A common thing I hear is people come from China and they come to the West and they're like, I can't use any of these delivery apps. Like everything is so far behind, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very different position for them to be in. I think that Bitcoin will play two roles in China's future. One is that for some people, there are some like this is the really cool part. It's almost like a rose growing in concrete. There are Chinese cypherpunks. And that is always really cool to see because again, Chinese people have such a wide variety of opinions and options, and you can't really choose where you're born, right? Like, you can be born in this context. But despite all the education about it, despite all the, whatever the curriculum, despite everything, there are people who are very strongly oriented towards like open source tech, towards freedom tech and things like that. And so I think that community of people, there will be builders and entrepreneurs and people who kind of come out of that. There will be people who kind of build things in Mandarin, things that will persist the knowledge of Bitcoin. So similar to how, Chinese people use VPNs and continue to use VPNs and use different methods of communicating, whether overseas or here, I think that, or overseas or there, I think that, Bitcoin still has a very important role to play as a tool that some Chinese people will use and that some Chinese people are kind of ideologically aligned with. That the idea that there can be money without the state and they can interact with a global community that might resonate with them more than even their local community, right? So I think that will happen. I don't know that it's like a ton of people, but there are definitely people like that. I've seen them. I've seen them interview on podcasts and things like that. And they actually are really cool people because they're getting out of their context. They're trying to get as much resources learning about Bitcoin as possible. They're trying to meet people outside, and they're trying to bring that knowledge back. There's a couple of MPubs I cited in the book. ALE, for example, is like a big one. He started this thing called the New BTC Maxis, which has a few thousand followers on Nostra. So it was very cool to see that. I think the larger role it will play, though, is we're at this interesting crossroads where China, I think like China's development path has been a really interesting thesis. We have known, like, for example, South Korea, that autocracy and economic growth can come together, right? I think you're seeing a softer version of this with India, by the way, with Modi, because what's happening there is that like you've had consistent rule under Modi for a while now, and he's been liberalizing markets and undoing some of the like more socialistic reforms back in the 80s and things like that. And so, the India is growing. That was always like a big counterfactual is like, well, China grew so fast, so why is India not growing? And in South Korea, when the first spurts of economic growth came out during the 50s, it was still a military dictatorship, right? So certainly China proved that you could do that for more than 1 billion people, let's say. So it was kind of proven out at a more, Singapore could have been a thesis as well, like the Asian tigers. Even Taiwan, when Taiwan went through its economic growth, it was still a martial dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek, right? So that was always known. Now the question is, what does it take to get to like the next step, right? So that I think is still like a little bit of an unknown. And there's a lot of different things right now. I mean, China's short-term economic growth is suffering. It's lagging. I mean, it's still large compared to what you might see in the United States or something. We're still talking about like trying to hit like a 5% clip annualized or something on GDP growth. But it's a far cry from the heydays of like, double-digit GDP growth and things like that, right? And so I think this younger generation I just described to you, they're going to have two or three tensions running to them. One is that the economy might, for the first time, they might see the first cycle within this version of China of the economy being worse for them than their parents. And I do think that's when you start seeing like instability and things like that. Because of the one child rule, there's a ton more men than there are women. And that's just also just going to create a ton of tension. China's very family based. So one of the most tragic expressions of the inequality of income in China is that someone in the New York Times ran a story about this. Actually, it's quite sad. You have like these millionaire bachelors who can pick and choose the woman of their choice. And then you have like the poorest people in China, their moms are going out to the street at the square being like, this is my son. Please marry my son. Like, I need to, like there's such a stark inequality there. And I think that generation is going to bump into this, like, it's glorious to be rich, but I'm not rich. And so it's like, how do I reconcile that? And how does China make it to this next step of growth? Is that by liberalizing even further and allowing people to use private monies, allowing people to create things beyond what the government creates. right? Political reform being just another liberalization where the party gives more freedom to people. I'm not sure. There are also some people who think the party will fall. I don't like to put bets on that. I think it's like very hard to tell. Look at Iran, for example. Iran is like a much weaker regime, much weaker economy. And somehow the mullahs have been in power for 50 years now. It's just so hard to predict these things. That could all disappear in an instant. We saw in Bangladesh right now with the protests, right? Like someone who ruled for 20 years, she had to leave right away because they stormed her house. So I never discount that as well, but it's just so hard to place bets on that. But my medium path on that is that the party will face this crux and have to decide whether or not to give more freedoms or not at the end of the day. And I think Bitcoin can play a role in that because some people will choose to take those freedoms by force in the sense of like themselves. They will say like, the system is unfair. I can't transact in and out of it. I can't make money. I can't make return on any of the assets. Unlike my parents had like a real estate market that was booming the whole time around. I don't own real estate and real estate's going down. The stock market is going down. I don't have a job. I can't earn anything. Right. So like, how do I persist my savings? How do I persist, my ability to earn, whether that's getting involved with Bitcoin, like the first generation of Bitcoin miners who grew stupendously rich, right? Or whether that's, holding Bitcoin. I think there is some portion of people who are going to do that. And that will force a larger discussion for the party. So I think the future of Bitcoin in China, I think there's a small segment of like cypherpunk Chinese and don't really know where that will lead, but very cool that they're there. And I think the larger thing of like, how do you run the economy? Bitcoin offers, first of all, an alternative tool and a hedge, but also an alternative vision that's very different from the current path that China has. And I think this will be important not only for China, but for other countries around the world. It's kind of why my book goes into like other countries, because China's trying to export its model kind of like an API to other countries. So it's almost like a nation by nation, kind of suite on that. And I do think the path of open source development, allowing more political and economic freedoms will win out, I think, personally. And Bitcoin has a role to play in that.
The book is Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? I enjoyed it tremendously, and I can't recommend it enough. If you're listening and you're interested. Roger, thanks so much for coming on the show to share your ideas. For listeners who might want to find more of you online, where should they go?
Yeah, I always tell people to hit me up on Nostra first. So Loki, Loki, the Norse trickster god, at Nostra-verify.com. So that's my NIP 05. I can also be found on LinkedIn if that's like, I don't know if people want to connect with me on LinkedIn. And then X, but I've been trying to wean myself off of X, but I'm at Roger H 1991. The book is available on Bitcoin Magazine store. I think that's the easiest way to buy it with Bitcoin, though I've heard that there are delivery issues. It's also available on Amazon and Ingram Books for people who are like wholesalers and things like that. And I also do physical. This is actually my coolest way of spreading the book. I actually bring not just my book, I bring like a bunch of other people's books as well. And so we're having the Gotta Pump It. I don't know if it will come out before this, but we're having the Bitcoin Block Party August 25th in Vancouver. So highly encourage anybody to come. I'll be in Victoria, New York City, different bit devs around the world. And so hopefully you'll also be able to give me lightning payments that way as well for the book. But but Scott, thank you so much for having me on. I know we've covered a lot of ground in the last little while. Hopefully some of this is helpful to your listeners, and always happy to recontextualize and rediscuss things if needed, but really appreciate you having me on, and really appreciate you reading the book and supporting it.
And if you're listening and you made it all the way to the end of the show, I want to thank you as well for tuning in, and hope to see you next week. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Block Reward. We're trying to do something different here, creating accessible conversations meant for people who aren't obsessed with Bitcoin. If you found this episode informative and engaging, hit that subscribe button to make sure you stay updated with future episodes. Your feedback matters. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment to share your reviews and help us with our goal of creating Bitcoin content that is simple and easy to understand. Bitcoin has an important role to play in the future of finance. It will change the way we save, spend, and invest. Discover why Bitcoin offers a game-changing opportunity for forward-thinking employers by visiting blockrewards.ca. Block Rewards' mission is helping Canadian employers implement strategies for integrating Bitcoin into compensation and benefits, supercharge your recruitment and retention strategies, and help your team members plan for the rising cost of living by rewarding their work with the hardest money ever invented. Special thanks to our top sponsor, Paramount Employee Benefits Consulting, Canada's only Bitcoin forward benefits and pension advisory. For more information, find them at paramountbenefits.ca. Big shout out to Podigy, our production team that makes all this possible, and BMX Escape for producing our music. Bitcoin is an expansive and dense topic many people walk away from early. To Bitcoin enthusiasts looking for that podcast they can share with friends, family, and colleagues, one they'll actually listen to, we hope that is us. The content of these conversations is meant to be provided for information purposes only. Nothing here is investment advice. Bitcoin is a big topic. Be sure to do your own research before making any personal financial decisions. Thanks for listening.